pray that you guide Steve, give him the words to say, open our ears and our hearts and our minds that we can understand how they're, and we thank you for what you do for us each and every day. It's in Christ's name we pray.
Amen. All right. So, if this is the first time you've gone through the church history class, just a little background that it's broken up into 7 segments. We're going to end Church History 1, and the reason why it was done that way is because I was following Philip Schaff, and he's got a 7-volume set on church history, one of my favorite set of books. And then also, it's 13 weeks because Pastor Jack and I, at the time, back in the late 90s, were alternating 13 weeks on Sunday school. So, having said all that, just as a background, this is the last lesson that we have on the apostolic age, called Persecutions in the Church at the End of the Century. And in this lesson, we're going to close out the apostolic age. We're going to look back over all that we've covered since, or when we look back over all that we've covered since the coming of Christ. We can, I think, agree with Philip Schaff when he says this. He says, we cannot but be amazed at the magnitude of the effects produced by the brief public ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. 3 years that changed the history of the world. And you already see that before the century is over. And so within a single generation, the name of Christ is spreading into most every city of the empire. A small but growing minority had become known as Christians. Now, initially, that's a nickname. That was actually a term of contempt. But it would be quickly embraced by the church as her most cherished association. Call me after the name of Christ, please. And following the events of AD 70, the Jewish ties to Christianity were largely severed. The destruction of Jerusalem marked a new direction for the church. She's weaned from her Jewish roots. And as Jesus had foretold, now you have the dawning of the time of the Gentiles, the age of the Gentiles. Now, what we know is from the time that the church begins, Jew and Christian, they're warning each other that God's judgment is coming. Each one was saying, God's going to get you, God's going to judge you. Both sides claiming that vindication is coming. And in 70 AD, that is the vindication of Christ. That's the way the first century saw it. And so a judgment event took place upon those who had pierced him, is what they believed had took place. From that watershed event, Judaism and Christianity go their separate paths. The Christian church became predominantly Gentile in her outlook, and the Jews who had always been apart withdrew even further. The remnant of the Jews become even more isolated than ever before. And then with the temple destroyed, the priestly and worldly Sadducees fade into history. They're not needed anymore. There's no temple. And Judaism became synonymous with the theology of the Pharisees by default. Sometime during the close of the first century, we have the documentation that shows that a new piece of liturgy was introduced into the synagogues. And that was the recitation of daily prayers for the destruction of the Christians. And the synagogues at this point become closed to Christian missionaries. What Paul was doing, going from synagogue to synagogue, is no longer possible. But they had served God's purpose. They had provided the greatest wealth of early converts. And they had sustained the church in her infancy. And the last gift of the synagogue was that the church is going to model herself on its forms and liturgy, even as she begins an identity of her own. Meanwhile, the Jewish war came to an end 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem. It took the Romans that long to retake the last mountain fortress of Masada. Stan and I have both been there. If you don't know the story, one of the great engineering accomplishments in all of military history. I'm sorry. Went too far. There we go. There used to be a fortress on top of Masada there. You can see, why does it keep doing that? I don't think so. Boo. Look at that. Look at that. I think there's this pointer thing might be, giving out. But anyway, but I did it again. You can see the ramp that the remains of the ramp that the Romans built to get their siege engines up to the wall. It's crazy. It's 300 feet up in the air. And on the eve of what would have been the last battle, every Jewish man, woman, and child took their lives so that the Romans wouldn't kill them, be able to kill them. In the Jewish war, the Zealots had tried to force the hand of God into sending the Messiah. That's really what they had done. And that fanatical hope came to an end on the summit of Masada. God had used their fanaticism, really to their own judgment, for having rejected the Messiah that he'd already sent, Jesus of Nazareth. And the instrument, of course, of God's judgment was the Romans. But the Romans had never experienced the kind of fanaticism that they'd faced in the Jewish war. They came to understand the power of the Jewish hopes of this conquering Messiah. So to put an end to these messianic dreams, the Emperor Vespasian decided to exterminate the royal line of David forever. And so the persecution of anyone who had direct lineage back to David began. So ironically, it was the Davidic persecution, not the earlier Christian persecution, that eventually caught Simeon, the cousin of Jesus and descendant of David, and he was put to death. Not as a Christian, but as a descendant of David. Now, with the war ended and the church at peace, Christianity's growth begins again at an even greater pace than before. Soon cities of Rome, Antioch, and Ephesus are new centers of the growing faith. In Rome, the first overseer of the church is Linus, a man mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:21 as a companion of Paul, not Peter, which is kind of interesting. Of course, the Catholic Church refers to him as their second pope after Peter. We know virtually nothing about Linus, but whatever his authority, it certainly was not anything like what the papacy would later become. At this time in church history, the term bishop is synonymous with presbyter, elder. That's all it is. The two words actually mean the same thing. They mean overseer. One term had its roots in Greek, the other term had its roots in Judaism. Linus was simply the chief elder amongst a plurality of elders. Another center of Christianity was Antioch. I got all kinds of weird stuff going on. In Antioch, the chief elder is a man named Ignatius. Ignatius would become one of the most famous martyrs of the next century. We'll talk about him. He was also be one of the most difficult of the early church fathers theologically. Again, we'll talk about that in the next series. But in Ignatius, we begin to see the seeds of that autocratic church. He makes the appeal to elevate the episcopus, the bishop, above the other elders. Again, that's a subject we'll talk about in church history too. There are some reasons why he thought that was a good idea, and we will look at that. The third and last of the growing centers of the faith was Ephesus. In Ephesus, the Apostle John, he is the heart and the soul of the churches in Asia. And the importance of John to the last decades of the first century, often overlooked. Paul's epistles, John's person, were the bridges to the next stage of the church. I mean, there's no question that there were variations between the Jewish Christian congregations and those that had been founded by Paul among the Gentiles and the Hellenistic Jews. There weren't differences of axiomatic doctrine, but questions of a practical nature. Things like differences in culture and the nature of church government. But in the last years of his life, it was John who worked to bring these two into a single harmonious faith. And I think a perfect legacy of that work is the Gospel of John itself. I think it was the last book written in the New Testament, personally. And we see that its thoughts are Jewish, its themes are Old Testament, its framework is Greek. He's combined them both beautifully under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, of course. As the first century closed and the church enters into the second century, it bears the distinct marks of John's gospel: love of God, love of the brethren, worship of the incarnate Word. We have a wonderful account of John in his extreme old age, and his disciples are carrying him to the meeting place because he's too old to do it himself. And as they carry him, he is repeating over and over and saying, "Little children, love one another. This is the Lord's command." And he just keeps saying that. Little children, love one another. Those are the last words that we have of the apostles. Little children, love one another. And not long after those words are recorded, John passes on. He's the last of the apostles to die. He's the only one not to die violently. And there's an interesting tradition that existed along the lines of the 21st chapter of John. We can read that. It says, Peter, seeing him, that is John, said to Jesus, "Lord, and what shall this man do?" And Jesus said unto him, "If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to you? You follow me." Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that this disciple would not die. Now that rumor was so persistent that after his death, a legend arose that John only slept in his grave and that the earth was gently moving with the rhythm of his breathing. However, we know that the rest of the passage in chapter 21 tells us that Christ is being misunderstood. John's not going to escape death. But with his passing, the remarkable age of the apostles goes with him. Meanwhile, as John strengthened the church, the Roman Empire after Nero is on the verge of collapse. There had been a succession of 3 generals who had taken the throne in less than a year before Vespasian arrives, conquers the city, wins the throne. And it was a common perception at the time that the end of the Roman world was actually at hand. But in a remarkable restoration of order and stability, Vespasian saves the empire. In gratitude, the Roman Senate deified him after his death in the year 79. However, you can see the bankruptcy of the pagan Roman religion because Vespasian himself joked on his deathbed as he's dying. He says, "I think I'm becoming a god." Obviously, he knew he wasn't really being deified. It was an empty, meaningless gesture. But with his passing, the empire goes to his son Titus. Remember, Titus is the conqueror of the Jews, and he was immensely popular. The significant event of his reign is the opening of the Roman Colosseum. And when it first opened, it held games for the first 100 days. In those 100 days, 9,000 animals died, 2,000 gladiators were killed. By the way, over its history, it's estimated that nearly 500,000 died in the Colosseum for sport, for entertainment. But within 2 years of taking the throne, Titus himself died. After Titus, the government came into the hands of his brother Domitian. Now, Domitian lacked any of the better qualities of Titus or his father Vespasian. He was cruel, he was a suspicious man, probably a better successor to Nero than his own brother Titus. Under his reign, many noble and illustrious Roman families were either slain or exiled just in order for him to confiscate and steal their property. Also, like Nero and Caligula, Domitian demanded to be called Lord and God. And toward the end of Domitian's reign, there appears to have been a localized, somewhat sporadic persecution of the church. He seems to have viewed Christianity strictly in political terms. What he saw here is a secret society. And he discovered that secret society even in his own family. The reason historians believe this is what happened is because of his most famous or prominent victim. It was his own cousin, Clemens Flavius. Flavius was executed under the charge of atheism. By that time, atheism was the Roman euphemism for Christianity. Because as a Christian, you're an atheist. You don't believe in the gods. And so the fact that members of Caesar's family were involved seems to be confirmation of Paul's words in Philippians chapter 4, in which he says, all the saints salute you, chiefly they that are of Caesar's household. So before the end of the century, Christianity had reached as far as the emperor's own house. However, that would have been alarming to a man with Domitian's paranoia. He is the first in the mold of the later emperors who really prosecuted Christianity not as a religion, but because they saw it as an empire within an empire. The church's sin in their eyes, again, wasn't about religion. It was in the fact that Christians would not assimilate. Even though Christians made the best of citizens, they refused to give full allegiance. And what was full allegiance? Well, it was to sacrifice in the name of the emperors. Basically to do what Domitian said, call me Lord and God. And the Christian said, no, I'm not going to do that. So Domitian would have seen it in that light. But at the time, it looks like a limited and very specific persecution. Namely, it was within those close to the power in Rome itself. For those accused of being Christians, the choice they were given was a simple one. Pledge your allegiance by giving an offering of veneration to the emperor or be put to death. And it's believed that many Christians were executed, nothing nearly approaching the numbers killed under Nero, but the way that Eusebius says it, he says, Domitian slain no small number of noble and illustrious men at Rome. Domitian also resumed the persecution of the descendants of David. The Jewish sedition had not ended really with the destruction of Jerusalem. It was still out there. In fact, a second and final revolt is about 40 years away. We'll talk about that in the next section. Therefore, Domitian and his government still view the Jews as a threat. And in a way, the persecutions of Davidic Jews and Christians come together in the great nephews of Jesus. These were the grandsons of Jesus' brother Judas. They were arrested, they were sent before the emperor, and they had two strikes against them, Christians and descendants of David. So Domitian probably would have viewed them as being kind of in the Christian royal family, since they're related to Jesus by birth. In the interview with Domitian, the nephews assure him, Christ is a heavenly kingdom, it's not an earthly one. But what really seemed to sway Domitian's mind was their obvious poverty. Domitian asked, what do you own? And they said, nothing, virtually nothing. They had a small plot of farmland, that's it. And then he asked to see their hands. They're calloused, they're rough. It's clear they're just simple farmers. And for Domitian, if these simple farmers represent a royal dynasty, Domitian felt he had nothing to fear. So they were released, and the Davidic persecutions ended. Also, ending was the second persecution of the church. Now, for the rest of this lesson, we're going to look at four things. We're going to look at the continuity of the church. We're going to look at the next generation of leadership. There's a comment or two on the dissemination of the Gospels and epistles, and then a brief description of the first century church. We're going to close with a contrast between the culture of the church and the culture of the contemporary Roman world around them. When the apostles died, the church faced a crisis of authority. The early historian Hegesippus put it this way. He said, when the sacred choir of apostles became extinct, and the generation of those who had been privileged to hear their inspired wisdom had passed away, then also the combination of impious error arose by the fraud and delusions of false teachers. All right, so in lesson 12, we looked at early heresies. A number of the false teachers claimed to be true followers of Christ. We know that they weren't. They were wolves in sheep clothing. But what preserved orthodoxy were the links back to the apostles. Those who had personal contact with the apostles and then preserved the apostolic traditions. They were the bridge between the first and second centuries. They were the bridge between the apostolic age and, frankly, every other age that followed. I mean, as we said, this was an especially strong link in the East because of the longevity of John. A number of important leaders of the next century knew John and sat under his teaching. Among those were Polycarp, who was bishop of Smyrna, Ignatius, bishop of Antioch, we talked about him, and Papias, and also the historian, he is bishop and historian of Hierapolis. In the West, the most important of the early church fathers is Clement, who was said to have been the same man that Paul refers to in Philippians 4:3. So again, you have some links, and the links between the next generation of leaders and the apostles. It's not the kind of apostolic succession that the Roman Catholic Church claims it to be, but it does provide continuity, it does provide authority. The Orthodox Church could point to a continuity with the apostles that no heretic could. And that was especially important in the years before you had the collection of the New Testament documents into what we know as our Christian scriptures. Our next subject is going to be the New Testament writings themselves, but only a couple of brief notes. The brilliance of the works of the apostles becomes even more pronounced when we place them side by side with any of the letters that follow. The epistles of Clement or of Ignatius, fine documents, worth reading, but the depth of the inspired word is not there. Only Clement's epistle to the Corinthians was read with any kind of frequency in the ancient church, but even it did not measure up to biblical standards. And the early church recognized this. Just like the Jews had with the Old Testament, the church zealously guarded the integrity of the New Testament and the documents that would eventually be bound together in the New Testament. So even as the Gnostics flooded the land with false writings and attributed them to various apostles, the New Testament documents stood out as unique products of divine inspiration. And they were already being differentiated from all other writings. They were being recognized as authoritative even by the end of the first century. And the church, as I said, guarded that content. With if you think about it, with just a few strategic alterations, a Gnostic could easily take, say, the book of John or the book of Colossians, made a very powerful weapon in the name of heresy. We don't find evidence of that kind of corruption. And the reason is that the church guarded the integrity of the New Testament writings. They would, anything of that nature, if it would have popped up, would immediately have been dismissed as fraudulent. And again, that's something that they learned from the Jews. The Jews' Old Testament, the reverence for the Old Testament. Another interesting feature was how the early letters were collected and copied. It's very much like the impact of the printing press during the Reformation. In this case, the new technology was the parchment codex. We would call it a bound book. Christians were among the very first to begin using the bound book, the codex. Pagans continued to use scrolls for another 2 centuries. But the codex made possible the accumulation of the epistles together into one volume. Remember, scrolls had a set length, but a codex allowed for accumulating larger groups of documents, which is perfect for a collection of letters in the Gospels. All right, a few characteristics of the first century church. By the year 100, as I said, Christianity could be found in every major city of the empire. Doesn't mean they were making themselves prominently known because the empire hated them. But the expansion of the church is a unique event in history. In the span of a little more than a generation, Christianity had grown from 120 on the day of Pentecost to around 7,500 by the end of the century. In less than 3 centuries, the number of Christians, at least those claiming the name of Christ, would be around 34 million people. And history has never seen anything like that. Secondly, it's important to note that the lives of Christians were an enigma to the pagans. heathen writers marveled at their self-sacrifice and their morality. For the Romans, the idea of giving without receiving in return, that was nonsensical. Why would you do that? And there were many generous Romans, but all the gifts that they gave came with strings attached. Whether it was public honor or simply expecting favors in return, Romans did not give without the expectation they're going to receive something back. In fact, pagan writers ridiculed Christians as being gullible. What are you getting out of this? You know, the Christians allowed the poor to flock to their congregations looking for charity. But if the early church was noted for one thing above all others, it was her care for the poor and her care for the homeless and the widowed and the elderly, none of which the pagans ever really did, nor did they understand why you would do it. Finally, and most importantly, while the modern church spends a lot of time and energy trying to influence our culture, it rarely presents the true gospel, nor does it present lives that are lived any differently from the unsaved around them, sadly. But by contrast, the early church didn't even try to influence its culture. In its early years, the church didn't try to make pagans Christians in name only or in behavior only. Christianity at this point was a culture in and of itself. They lived quietly as bakers and farmers and potters, whatever they were, but their lives were their testimonies. While the church didn't isolate itself, it also kept its distinctiveness. So to look at the distinctiveness, we're going to look at some of the characteristics of the early church and what made it different from the world around it and from the religions around it. First of all, it had a distinct government. The church at this point had two patterns for its government. In the Palestinian churches before the destruction of Jerusalem, the church was roughly patterned after the Jewish Sanhedrin. In that context, you had a chief officer. He's invested with a greater authority than any of the other institutions, like the synagogue. But in the Hellenistic churches, the pattern was the Hellenistic synagogue. And the synagogue had a council of elders from which a president was elected. In theory, he's still their equal. This was the model for the Pauline churches, which were predominantly populated by Hellenistic Jews. In a broad sense, you might say that the churches in the land represented an episcopal form of government under a bishop, while the Pauline churches represented a more Presbyterian form of government. Of course, that's anachronistic. I'm just using terms that come later. And even then, you have to throw in a little bit of congregationalism in because the first deacons are elected by popular vote. So in the details, there's diversity in how the churches function. But what made all the churches distinct from the pagan religions around was that there's no sacerdotal priesthood. Sacerdotal means mediating. There's no priest between God and man. We don't see that anywhere. That's a development that will come many centuries later into the Catholic Church. So, we know that there's no one in the New Testament record that comes between you and Christ. It's really a priesthood of all believers, as Luther would say. But none of the pagan religions were like that. You always had a sacerdotal priest standing between you and the gods. All right? Also, the church had distinct sacraments, which is communion and baptism. In the earliest days, communion was combined with what was called the love feast. The love feast was actually a charitable function. It was meant to be an opportunity for those who had wealth to provide a common meal for those who had nothing. Later, communion and the love feast would be separated, and that was primarily because of the abuses of the wealthy. There are recorded complaints about the wealthy who would then gorge themselves while depriving the poor, and that may have, so there may have been other reasons why they broke those two things apart, but clearly the churches did not want communion, which is her most sacred liturgy. They didn't want that to be tainted by that kind of behavior in what was called the love feast. In baptism, the thing that we often argue about the most is the mode. How do you perform it? And it doesn't appear to be much of an issue in the early church. From what we can tell, the preferred mode was immersion, but there was also effusion and aspersion, that is, pouring and sprinkling. Early in the 2nd century, we're going to get a lot more information on baptism. We'll present that in the next section. Suffice it to say, there were there were preferences, but there are no restrictions on how you did it. The church also had a distinct sense of community. Christianity was a community of faith. It wasn't an individualistic religion. That's why excommunication could be used as an effective discipline. Because to be removed from the church as the community of faith was to be removed from the benefits of Christ. And that's the way they took it. Now, that's not to diminish individuality. For the early church, individuality was not in conflict with community. Instead, individuality was fulfilled by serving the community. Now, of course, nothing was more distinct than the church's message. At this point, many of the doctrinal issues of Christ and salvation, they have not yet been officially formulated. But they are believed implicitly. They're just not described explicitly yet. So the proclamation of the Christian message is very much along the lines of Peter's Pentecost sermons. Basically, you're under judgment, but God has provided a deliverer in the crucified Christ. And this Christ rose bodily from the tomb. And if you trust, put faith in this Christ, you'll be saved. That's basically it. So despite shades of differences in other areas, the essentials of the Gospels were held by all in common. There was also a common sense of morality, and that made for a distinct discipline of morality that their heathen neighbors took notice of. And most of the churches enforced this morality through discipline. Now, that's not to say there weren't difficulties. After all, first century believers are just as much fallen sinners as we are. So they have those same problems. Strife didn't disappear. In fact, at the end of the century, we have the first church split. What church do you think that was? Corinth. What else?
Exactly.
We'll talk more about it, but the Corinthians kicked out their elders at the prompting of, quote, some young men. We don't know who those young men were, but it caused Clement of Rome to write them a letter. And he wrote to the Corinthians admonishing them to bring those elders back and to fall back under discipline. But this type of situation was the exception, not the norm. Most of the churches had a very strong innate sense of discipline and didn't need letters from outside. And remember, you had to do that. It had to be that way because in the face of heresy and persecution, you had to have a sense of discipline or you fall apart. And you had to preserve the integrity of the church. There's all kinds of, we'll talk about it, but there's all kinds of slander going on about who Christians are and what they're doing. So you needed that discipline. Finally, I want to contrast the churches to the pagan culture that the church found itself in contact with. So what I'm going to do is give a few characteristics of the Roman world at the time. So first of all, there were more slaves than free men under Roman law. In fact, at one point, the Roman Senate considered, hey, why don't we mark our slaves to help identify them? Until they realized, well, that would let the slave population in on a secret that they actually outnumber the citizens. Let's not do that. So they left them unmarked. And a slave's life was at the mercy of utilitarianism. You could expect to live only as long as you remained useful. The old, the weak, and the sick were often cast out from their master's care to die once their usefulness is over. And for the most part, they viewed their slaves as simply a commodity to be used up. And when you're used up, it's over, it's done. Also cast out to die were children. Abortion was not uncommon. And the pagan Celsus tells us that its dangers left many women dead or barren. The preferred method of getting rid of unwanted children was actually exposure after birth. Simply leave them to die, especially of girls. We have one famous correspondence from a typical and seemingly loving Roman husband named Hilarion. And he's writing to his pregnant wife, and he tells her, if the child is a boy, keep it, but if the child is a girl, discard it. And that was the common sentiment. And typically, unwanted children were simply abandoned along the streets like garbage. Sometimes they would be left in public places like the Colosseum. And if these newborns weren't killed by roving packs of dogs, this allowed scavengers from the brothels to pick them up to be raised as prostitutes. In a recent archaeological find, actually in Palestine, an ancient Roman brothel was uncovered. It had a large bathing pool. This bathing pool had a kind of a channel underneath, a drain. In that drain were uncovered dozens of infant skeletons. It had been children born of prostitutes. They had drowned them and simply shoved them down the drain. Now, in this particular case, in the brothel, the infants were male because the girls were saved to be stock for the brothel. But it's ironic that the modern feminist movement has labeled Christianity as anti-woman when pretty much everything that it owes to the freedoms we have in the society, it owes to Christianity.
That's right.
Christianity freed them from being regarded as little more than property that could be discarded at whim. Even if a female was allowed to live, her life was not around. Marriage and divorce, life and death, were strictly at the whim of the man. In fact, it was often at the whim of Caesar. He could mix and match marriages for political reasons. It didn't matter. Even taking women from their husbands and giving them to other men, Caesar would do that if it fit his purpose. And so you really see the difference between the church and the pagan culture in this issue of women, because in the church, women were respected. They were protected. In fact, women greatly outnumbered men amongst the early converts. Now, we've already mentioned prostitution, but homosexuality was also commonly practiced in the Roman world. Now, it was frowned upon by the common population, but amongst the aristocracy and in the imperial courts, it was really rampant. Bisexuality and the abuse of young boys, widely practiced. Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Caligula, Nero, Domitian were all examples of prominent Romans who had sodomite relationships. Finally, as we've already mentioned, the chief amusement of the Roman world was the shedding of blood. The slaughter of wild animals, men, women, and children was performed in staggering numbers simply as entertainment. And it is overwhelming to read of the perverse ways that the Romans devised to inflict death in the arena. I'm not going to get into all those details. Many of them were horrific and lewd beyond belief. All of them were calculated to provide novelty to a people who had grown callous towards the shedding of blood. We need a new way to murder these people. By the way, there is a descendant of the Roman games that continues today for 2,000 years. What is that? Yeah. Bullfighting. It's a direct descendant, unstopped all the way from the Roman world. All right. So the Roman world that Christianity confronted has been summed up this way. It says, the empire of the Caesars was a soulless one. It provided its people with the protection of law, of prosperity and peace, but it robbed them of virtue and any nobleness that might have survived from the culture of the Greeks. In every way, they are reminiscent of the American culture, especially in their preoccupation with debased entertainment and hero worship of their celebrities. That is true. Not infrequently, the fights of beasts and gladiators consumed 20,000 human lives in a single month. By this barbarity, the minds of the common people had been seared of all nobler feeling. One Roman writer lamented that innocence is not simply scarce, it is non-existent. And so all of these traits of that evil age are overturned by the power of the gospel.
That's right.
It was Christianity that put an end to human suffering as mere entertainment. It was Christianity that elevated the status of women to a place of dignity and respect. It was Christianity that eventually freed the slaves, took care of the old, protected children, restored some measure of sexual decency. You have the first orphanages, schools, all these things that we take for granted that did not exist in the Roman world, and it was the church that put them in place. And so the truth is that the many so-called glories of Rome weren't very glorious on a human level. They were often brutal. It's often been said that the West was built on the three pillars of Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem. If you want to trace out human dignity and mercy, you have to go through Jerusalem. That is the scriptures. Right? And we should be thankful that our legacy does go through Jerusalem. All right, any quick questions? We got a couple of minutes.
One thing to bring out was, on his deathbed, Jacob said, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, the lion's head, until Shiloh come." And it was a prophecy because it turned out the kingship started with David and his descendants in the tribe of Judah. And when he said the scepter won't depart from Judah until Shiloh, which means the one sent, or the one whose right it is, or both. That's as best I know. And it was a prophecy of the coming Christ.
Yeah.
And the fact that when Jesus was born, one gospel shows, here's his lineage. Mary was a direct descendant of King David. Joseph, who would have had some claim to the throne, was a direct descendant of King David. So it showed that Jesus, on both ways, whichever way you wanted to count it, was a direct, they could call him a son of David, and they knew it.
Yes.
And then afterward, there was such an effort to obliterate his line. It does lead you to believe the scepter has departed because they don't have any idea or any genealogical records to prove anyone alive is a descendant of David anymore. So that was one. Another one I wanted to call out was, sorry to tell everyone that we still have monstrosities like that going on today.
Absolutely.
Even in our own country.
Absolutely.
And even with our recent election, Martin Luther King called out the Roman Empire was absolutely barbaric. They engaged in infanticide. And Martin Luther's descendants, his niece, Alveda King, she said that if Martin Luther King hadn't been assassinated, he would have spoken out against, hey, we're going right back to infanticide now. We think that's just fine. So we still have those monstrosities, and they're very prolific. And sometimes all you have to do is just go over the border to another state, and we're cool with that in this country.
Absolutely.
Now, God is not cool with it. So that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. So, in context, we are debasing ourselves and our society and our culture further and further all the time. What we'll end up seeing, of course, we're always dealing with fallen human beings. And as we'll see over the course of the next, all the way up through Church History 7, dealing with human beings, even within the church, it's a story of some pretty horrific, things. But if you just look at the general tenor, right, if you just look at society as a whole, Christendom was, in its premise, wrong, false, but we'll talk about that at some point. But it does, Christianity influences the culture, creates the West as we know it, and elevated. It was like, floating all the boats, right? And what we've done is, as we've rejected Christ and rejected Christianity, every generation a little bit more, God is allowing that leash to go out and out and out, and we become more and more base.